Alright guys, so in this video we're going to take a look at forms in Bootstrap. So notice over here in 3_5 forms, it's pretty ugly looking. It's just like a default HTML form with no styling at all. And notice that where it says start here, we have a form and then we have a bunch of text fields inside of a div. Okay, so we're putting a label and an input inside of a div, and this div is actually a form group. So that's what we want to do, is give it a class of form group to basically say that this label and this input, they go together, they're a group. And then for the input, to make it look much better, we want to give it a class of form control. Like that, and save, and you can see that looks much better. The label is now above it, and we have a nice block level input with some padding. In fact, if you want to look at it in the dev tools, so if we look at form control, it's display block, it has a width of 100%, it's got padding, font size is bigger, line height, color, border, all that stuff. So it really makes the input look better. And if we look at form group, basically it's just it gives it a little margin on the bottom, and it's just semantically it wraps the label and the input. Okay, so let's do the same for these other ones. We'll say class equals form group, and on the input, form control. Okay, I'm just going to copy the form group div here, and we'll put that here and this one here. So we'll save. Actually, we need the form control on the inputs, and save. All right, so you can see that these four inputs or form groups, they look a lot better. Now, if you wanted to change the size, you could do that as well. So let's say the email one, we wanted to be a large input. We could add to form control -LG, and save, and notice now it's more prominent, it's bigger. For a company, let's say we wanted it to be smaller, then we could say form control-SM and save, and now it's smaller. Another thing we could do is add some form text. So for the email address, let's say we wanted to let the user know that their email address won't be shared. We could put a small tag here with the class of form text, and I'm also going to add the class of text muted to make it lighter. And then inside here we'll say your email will not ever be shared, and save. And now we have a little message underneath our input. All right, so let's see, we can also make them read only if we want, which isn't really Bootstrap, but just to show you what it looks like, we could add a read only class, and we can't type anything in here. All right, now the form group goes for selects and text areas and stuff as well. So let's add to the select group here form group, and form control also applies. So class form control, and we'll save it, and now the select looks much better. It goes all the way across, it spans, the label is above it, just looks better. Same thing with text area. So we'll say form group, and we'll add to this form control, and save, and that looks much better. It does look a little weird because we have the large input and the small input, but if they were all the same, that it's a pretty decent looking form. So let's take a look at file inputs. So we have two different ones here. We have the regular file input. There's also something called the custom file input. So for the regular one, we're going to take the input here. Actually, let's make this a form group as well. And then we're going to take the input and add a class of form-control-file. All right, and then we also have this small tag here, and let's add our form text class. Oops, we need our class form text, and we'll say text muted. Just basically saying the max size is 3 megabytes. All right, so this is what it looks like here. Now, the custom file input, I think, looks a lot better. So what we'll do is give this a class, and we're going to give this a class of custom file. And then the input itself will have a class of custom-file-input. And then for the label here, we're actually going to give this a class of custom-file-label. So if we save that, it looks like this, and this looks, I think this looks much better than this. If we click browse here, it'll open up the Explorer. Same thing if we click choose file. All right, so we also have a range input. So by default, it's just input type range, but let's wrap it in a form group. And then we want to add a class to the input. And that class is going to be custom-range. And if I save that, you'll see that it looks a lot better now. Now these ranges have different attributes. So for instance, min, let's say the minimum value will be 1. Basically, it's all the way, if we make it go all the way to the left, that'll be 1. And let's say the max will be 5. And then the step is each scroll, if we drag it, each one will be equal to 1. And we can also set a default value, we'll say 1. So if I save that, it'll start at 1. Now I can go step to 2, 3, 4, and 5. Okay, and you can obviously change these attributes up. All right, so let's see. And every form will have a submit button. So we would just add like nothing special, just a button class. So button primary, and maybe we would do button block and save. Okay, so basic form. Now we can also have inline forms, which are good for like logins, stuff like that. So for that, we would take the form and add a class of form-inline. And just doing that, you can see that now everything is lined up, but we want to also add our form control class. Okay, so we want to do that. We probably want to add some margin right as well. So we'll say mr-2, and then we'll add that same to this input here. And then for this remember me label, let's actually add a form check class here. So for a checkbox, we can say form check. And then for the label, we'll say form check label. And then for the actual input, we'll say class form check input. All right, so if I save that, now if the screen is too small, it's going to look a little weird. Let's go ahead and make this bigger. And now you can see it's all in line. The button looks horrible, so let's fix that. Let's see, where were we? Inline form. So for the check label, so this here, let's actually add some margin right, mr2. And for the button, we'll say class btn light and save. And there we go. So now we have an inline form. All right. We also have form rows. If you want to use if you want to use the grid system with the form, I know we haven't gone over the grid yet, but this is pretty easy. What we would do is take the form, not the form tag, but we'll put a div in here and give this a class of form-row. Okay, when we use the grid, it's just class row, and we'll get to that. But we also have form row, and then on these divs, we just want to make these columns. So class call. And of course, we'll add our class of form control to our inputs. And then this div here, we'll say class call. And we'll add form control. All right, so if I save that, now we have a form row. So basically, we have two inputs next to each other. All right, so now I want to talk a little bit about validation. Now, obviously, validation is something that you do within, you can either do front-end validation with JavaScript, or you can do back-end server-side validation and communicate with the front end. But basically, Bootstrap gives us certain classes to, for instance, make the input have a red border if there's an error, stuff like that. Also give error messages. So let's turn this into a better looking form, first of all. So we'll add a form group. I know this is repetitive, but it's going to really drill it into your brain. So let's say form group, and this one here. And we also want, for our inputs, form control. Grab that. Okay. So notice that I have we have some form groups, and then we have this div with an error. So password not strong enough, password does not match. By default, with no classes here or anything, it's just going to show. But I'm going to show you how we can use validation markup. So let's say we submit this form and the username is correct. Okay, so what we would do in the JavaScript is we would want to add the class of isValid. So if I add the class of isValid here, is-valid, to the input and save, it gives it a green box. All right, now you would probably add this through JavaScript. You do some kind of check, and then you'd add the class of isValid. All right, now if something is not valid, then what we would do is add the class isInvalid and save, and that'll give a red box. Okay, now for this div right here, we want to add the class of invalid-feedback and save, and that will make it red. Now, what's cool about this is if we don't have this isInvalid class, if I get rid of that and I save, that error message with invalid feedback is not going to show. So we could have this message here and have it not show, and then in our JavaScript, if something goes wrong with our server, or the password doesn't match or something, we'll just add the isInvalid, and then not only will the red box show, but the message will also show. Okay, so that's how that works. And just to show you down here, we'll say isInvalid, and we'll add the class here to this div of invalid feedback. Okay, so there we go. So that's how it's basically just the UI of the validation. We're not actually doing the logic, which would be in JavaScript, which is obviously beyond the scope of this course. But it is cool to be able to implement it like this with Bootstrap. All right, so you can see the forms look much, much better than they did at first. So in the next video, we're going to kind of stick to forms a little bit and talk about input groups. All right, so I will see you in the next video.